me, the opportunity to reflect on youth work in Australia from afar is really useful. And to be able to experience youth work in Estonia and to talk to Estonians about youth work, particularly Ilona and your team at the University of Tallinn, but also the other people that I've met from the University of Tartu and also the Finnish researchers and so on, very stimulating and very interesting. And also just being here, being able to think about Estonian history and culture and the relationship of youth work to it. Being able to go to the Museum of Occupation and Freedom and to think about, well, what does that mean for youth work? In Australia, we don't have such recent history of occupation. So how has that shaped Estonian youth work? But how might it also be useful for us in Australia to think about our relationship to British youth work and the British colonial influence, because they were occupiers in a sense. So what does that mean? And in a way, our youth work in Australia is not particularly Indigenous, and what I mean by that is it's not that it's been influenced particularly by Aboriginal Australians, but how localised is it? How relevant is it to Australian youth work, to Australian people, or have we just adopted or adapted British youth work? So thinking about Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of Freire, that has become very influential in English-speaking youth work, particularly that influenced by the British and in Australia, and what alternatives to that might be. So while I've been here thinking about, well, what are the other non-formal education traditions? What are the alternatives to Freire? And looking at things like folk schools and community and cultural education, study circles, and particularly where they've been practiced in a number of countries in Northern Europe, I think has been quite interesting. There are lots of parallels in that perhaps more Indigenous, if you like, more localised non-formal education pedagogy or tradition than to Freire, but there are lots of parallels really. Egalitarian, democratic, important commitments to participation of ordinary people, and also outcomes of civil change, positive change for local communities. So very similar to Freire. And this sort of idea of dialogue, of being able to discuss and talk as equals, and to question one another respectfully and to come to some consensus or meaning. I think, again, very similar to Freire, but of course this tradition is over 100 years old. In fact, Danish folk schools, it's a couple of 100 years old, so predates Freire, so very interesting. I think in the Australian context we've been focused very much on human rights for some years now, and that's been important for us to think about participation and empowerment of young people as a human right, the opportunity for them to have a voice and a say in decisions that are being made about them, with them, and that decisions are made in the best interests of young people. So that's been an important idea. But where does that come from? How does that translate in terms of non-formal education as a practice? I think is a really good question. What would that mean for Estonian youth work, for instance, to think about that in the Estonian context? We had an interesting discussion today about knowledge and decision-making for young people. And if young people don't have knowledge or information, then what choices do they really have? What are they choosing without knowledge and information in regard to the range or options in their choices? So this idea of the role of youth worker as a connector to various options and possibilities and choices, but also a translator of information and knowledge that enables young people to be informed about the decisions and the choices that they're making, I think is actually quite important, and it seems to me quite fundamental to non-formal education. And the idea that it's not just sort of providing expert information or knowledge, but that it's a dialogue about that knowledge. It's a dialogue about the choices and the options. So it's a discussion about what young people may choose or decide to do or whatever. So I think, as a sort of theoretical idea, non-formal education, pedagogical idea, this sort of concept of discussion, dialogue, information, knowledge, choice, options, I think trying to sort of translate that into, well, what would that mean in our everyday practice with young people? What would that mean on a day-to-day basis? I think that's quite important. I think the other idea is one that we've talked about a bit over these last few weeks, has been reflective practice. What does it mean to reflect on your practice and to learn by thinking about what you've been doing on your own, but also with others, importantly with others, enabling them to reflect and reflect together. Again, that's a sort of Freyerian idea, but it's also just a general non-formal education idea, that we are learning by discussing with others and reflecting on our practice, what we're doing, our actions, and taking that into our next actions, our next days, our future work, and that's informing that work, hopefully improving that work. So I think there are two ideas in that sort of non-formal education tradition that we can take into our youth work. Well, I think you need to have a commitment and a passion for young people. I think if you don't have that, it's hard to sustain working with young people, I think. I don't think youth workers do it for the money necessarily, because it's not always the highest paid job, but it's an incredibly rewarding and fulfilling job. It gives you the opportunity to have enormous impact and influence on people's lives, but also on the community for good, to shape communities, to bring about, yes, change, but also social change. So I think, and youth work enables you to do a range of things, and to work in a range of contexts. Yes, to help ameliorate social issues, yes, that's part of youth work, but it's much broader than that. It's an incredible privilege and honour to just be part of young people's lives as they grow and develop and change and move through the sort of the life course. What an amazing thing to be part of somebody's life and to share it, and hopefully to be of some benefit to a young person in part of that process. So yes, it's very rewarding. So I think that's a reason to study youth work. I think if you want to bring about change, often people talk about helping, but I think it's more than that. I think it's actually about, there's the potential for social change, I think. Young people are actually much more powerful than they realise that they are, particularly young people when they come together collectively in solidarity. Today there's the climate strike in Estonia. My son participated last Friday in Australia. There were 100,000 young people who rallied and protested on the streets and in front of our parliament. And I think that's happening today in Estonia. So I think, the future is uncertain. We're concerned about climate change, and young people rightly so. And I think it's important that their voice is heard and that they also become aware of the power that they have to be able to bring about change. And youth work's part of that. That's one of the roles and part of the process of youth work, is to enable and facilitate the voice of young people and to bring about positive social change. So I think that's another reason to study youth work.